Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the seminar this week. We're delighted to have an alumni from Stanford back, Dave Markowitz. He is now an associate professor at... Dave and I actually go way back. We were at Cornell together, where he actually did his undergraduate there, and then went away and did some work and decided that he wanted to get back into academia. And when he came back, we both moved over here to Stanford. So he was my first Stanford PhD student. And since then, he has gone on to do some pretty amazing things. He's published in some of the top journals, not only in communication, but in science overall, many more than I have. It's just an incredible feat. But one of the things that I love about Dave's work that I think will be powerful for us here is he really pays a lot of attention to the way that we talk in really important spaces that then ultimately tell us fundamental things about ourselves. Today, we're going to talk about this really special space, obituaries, and what they tell us about us. But he's done other ones, everything from how when young musicians, there's a number of them that all died at age 27. Some have died because of suicide, some because of accidents. And he would compare those folks and just to understand from their lyrics maybe what they were going through psychologically at the time. All the way to the doctor's office and how doctors treat patients of different ethnicities. So it's just incredible the amount of work, information and knowledge we can learn when you take the kind of care that Dave does looking at language. So please join me in welcoming Dave Markowitz.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and it's really awesome being back. It's one thing to yearn to be back to the place that you feel like you grew up academically, but it's another thing to talk about where you've been over the past few years, at least some of the things I've been studying. So I'm really excited to tell you about what I've been thinking about and how I've been doing work over the past several years. What I like to do is I like to give you a little bit of information about me as a person in this world and where I come from. And some of that stuff helps inform the way that I do my work. I'm a New Yorker and I'm also a musician. And when you blend those two things, nobody growing up was bigger in my world than Bruce Springsteen and the E Street Band. I want to be just like Clarence Clemens, the larger-than-life saxophone player here on the left. But I also want to be just like Bruce Springsteen on the right for a bit of a different reason. I felt like I could really understand who Bruce Springsteen was from his lyrics, what he was going through socially, psychologically, and what he was experiencing in the world in the moment that he was writing his songs. Now, fast forward to today, I'm someone who still cares a lot about music and also cares a lot about language, but I rest on the shoulders of massive folks who really sort of spearheaded this, both people who care about language and also people who also do not care as much about language. So, for example, Stanley Milgram, famous, infamous at the same time, social psychologist, suggested if the world was drained of every individual and we had just the messages that went back and forth between them, we'd basically have enough to reconstruct social psychology. And Ferdinand de Saussure back in 1910 suggested that psychologically, what are we apart from our words and apart from our language? These two things probably don't exist. So language patterns not only represent the form and the function of everyday life, what I'm hopefully going to try to convince you of today is this idea that if we really care about consequential aspects of society and about the human condition, one starting point for us is to look at the words that people use, what they say, how they say it, and counting these things to make larger inferences about social and psychological processes. Now, to begin, what I want to do is give you a bit of a toy model, if you will, of how I approach the world in this regard. I rely on a lot of the fundamental work by James Pennebaker. The Pennebaker approach is largely this idea that something psychological happens in a person's life that changes how they think and feel in the world. This influences how they communicate, and we can pick up on this psychological shift with specific language dimensions. And I'll give you an example here. So many folks in clinical psychology will often look at aspects of psychological well-being. One aspect of psychological well-being is depression. So clinical psych work will find that the folks who are highly depressive, they have a different worldview in the moment that they are experiencing the psychological distress compared to people who are non-depressive. They tend to focus on the here and now, their immediate disposition. They are present focused compared to those who are non-depressive. We can indicate that by looking at how people are focusing their attention on the self. I, me, my words, right? What we're trying to do with this overall enterprise is to understand what's going on up here through language patterns. And language patterns are markers of one's attention. So for example, people who use high rates of negative affect, words like hate, disgust, or awful, they are attending to a negative state rather than feeling negative necessarily. Okay. One of my favorite studies, I'll give you a little bit of backdrop here of how we actually can study this, was done by Sarah Siraj, Kate Blackburn, and Jamie. They looked at when people were broken up with and they wrote about it online. So time zero, broken up with. They said on Reddit, there's about 6,000 Redditors, over 1 million posts, and time zero is when they said they were broken up with. Anything before zeros, they were still in the relationship. Anything after time zero, they are single, right? What you can see here with I, me, and my words on the bottom left is that there's a giant peak in distress as indicated by language patterns. But the breadcrumbs of this distress are happening weeks beforehand. People are picking up on the fact that there's something different about the relationship. There's something different about their life. So counting words helps us understand what is going on up here in the social and psychological world that people have. So the large take home here is that we often want to think about something psychological, collect a bunch of language data, and figure out what the relationships between psychological processes and words are. And today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you what I've been thinking about over the past 5 years or so, or several years. It takes a little while to publish some of this stuff. And I'm going to walk you through 3 big things that I've been focusing on. 1, what it means to live a good life. 2, how do we organize? And 3, how do we learn? Okay. Few things. Number 1, obviously language matters, and we see that in everyday life. But 2, the psychological underpinnings of language are often misunderstood or hidden. And we need to understand that at a deeper level as social scientists. And what I'm going to do to scaffold these 3 things is to borrow from the medical sciences, in which they think about how do people innovate in medicine. They innovate by first diagnosing the problem, so understanding it, predicting the future, so what people might have as a prognosis, and then the last part of catalysis, so how you can use what you know social sciences and then generate new knowledge from what people have done in the past. Okay, so in this first area, as Jeff suggested, what I'm going to be talking about is how we can understand what it means to live a good life and how we can think retrospectively about all who've come before us to understand that really consequential question. So in order to understand this, there are a lot of people invested in understanding this idea. So a lot of philosophers and psychologists really care about what it means to live a good life. And you bet investors and people who are trying to figure out future planning for others really care about it. So for example, Merrill Lynch in 2018 had a really impactful study asking people, what does it mean to live a good life? What are the definitions that you all have about a life well lived? As you'll see here, a majority of people really suggest that having family and friends that love you really matter to people, in addition to making a positive contribution and impact in society. Fame, less so, right? But still a non-trivial number here from about 3,000 individuals. Over 80% of people also suggest that they really want to leave a positive legacy behind. And how do we do that, or how do we understand it? It's through the lens of obituaries, these artifacts that people leave behind that persist over time and space about those who we really wanted to remember. So I like to think metaphorically sometimes. So I often think about obituaries as cultural and psychological time capsules. We can go back in time, as these are often frozen about an individual, right? This is as we remember the person in the moment that we are thinking and feeling their loss, right? And the real impact that obituaries have is that not only are they frozen in time and capture this intense feeling, but they also really help to understand what it means to remember someone and what it really means to live a good life at scale, okay? So there are 3 big things that guided our entire enterprise here, and I'll go through them. The first one is that we want to see what are the basic guiding life principles that people reflect on when they're trying to remember someone who they've lost. Number 2, we want to look at how those are moderated by big things that happen in the world, these big cultural events. I'm going to be talking about 9/11. I'm also going to be talking about the COVID pandemic. And the last one is how are stereotypes about individuals, particularly related to gender and age, how are they reflected in obituaries at scale? And this cultural and psychological time capsule idea hopefully is ringing true, where we can take the lens back and really understand large sociological trends from these massive artifacts that we can corral. Now, there's a theory in psychology called Schwartz's basic human values theory. It's this large idea that there are 10 guiding life principles that are cross-cultural, they happen across various continents, and they happen to be major themes in how people orient to the world. I'm not going to go through all 10 today because that would be about a 2-hour talk, but I'm going to focus on 2 big ones, and you'll see in a few slides why I've focused on these 2. The idea of a guiding life principle of benevolence and of tradition. So the idea of benevolence is caring for close others. Right? We really care about being social connectors. We really care about those who we are engaged with in everyday life. As you'll see here, an example of an excerpt basically that was found in some of our data, not only direct references to people, but also social connection type of words. And the idea of tradition, social norms, and also a focus on religion are really focused on high rates of this personal value. So how do we study these basic human values in obituaries at scale? Well, legacy.com is a massive aggregator of all these obituaries, largely in the US and also internationally. And they cover about 70% of deaths in the US. What we did is we collected about 38 million of them from 1998 to 2024. And the real home run here is all the metadata that are associated with each obituary text. So we know the age, where they died, the gender of the individual we're able to infer from their name, and a range of other metadata that were associated with that. So we have text data. How do we make that quantifiable? How do we take text and make it into numbers? We count them using computers, right? And there's a program that was pioneered by Jamie Pennebaker and colleagues called Luke, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And it contains a bunch of social, psychological, and part of speech dimensions that are all human validated. This personal values dictionary was also human validated. So words that are related to tradition are subsumed into that larger category. And it counts words like this. So I often like to give a little acknowledgement to where I'm giving a talk here. So Stanford has a beautiful campus. Anything outside of white space is being counted as a word, right? So there are 5 words in this entire phrase. Stanford, while it's probably commonplace here on campus, it's not common for the average person outside of Palo Alto or outside of Stanford. That's not going to be in its internal dictionary of categories. The word has is an auxiliary verb, is an article, beautiful an adjective, and campus is a work-related term. So the number of words is always the denominator, and therefore we're controlling for how verbose a piece of text actually is. So now that we have all these obituary texts and we're having computers do the heavy lifting, we can actually see what personal values are represented most over the course of time. So you'll see here over time, there's a relative increase in these 10 personal values. The 2, again, that we're going to really focus on are the ones at the top. They're represented over 75% of obituaries. So you'll see here that tradition and benevolence were the most popular. And I'm going to get to in a second what's going on with benevolence. Caring for close others after the pandemic seems a bit of a paradox, but we'll get to that in a second. That's addressing the first main interest. The second one, how are these cultural events in the world shifting the representation of personal values over time? If we look at 9/11, for example, tradition and benevolence relative to a baseline period of about 2 months, significantly increasing at least 1 year after 9/11. And what's kind of remarkable is that where people are in the world also matters for how these personal values are represented. As I mentioned before, I'm a New Yorker. The epicenter of 9/11 being in New York, was modifying how personal values were also represented. So we can see here way more caring for close others for those who passed away in New York compared to all other states, and a decrease in one of the personal values that I talk about here, security, the sense that you're in control of those and your personal surroundings. So we see that not only are these things impacted on the individual level, but we pull the lens back to these big social and psychological and sociological shifts. We can see how they're moderated by where people are, this language location link. Now, returning to that big idea of benevolence decreasing over time around the pandemic, we can see that caring for close others 4 years after the pandemic has not returned to baseline, right? So what's really remarkable is that we often felt that there is this need to care for others, but people often had a really difficult time naming it. Naming it, especially in obituaries, public expression of caring for others might have been really difficult for people who are going through this highly distressing, disturbing time. We felt it internally. Expressing it externally was quite difficult. That's what we think is sort of going on here. And then finally, to see this sort of big shift based on the demographics and the identity of the individuals, I'm going to show you a ton of lines here, but I'll basically break down what they mean. Men are represented in blue, women are represented in orange. If we focus on just one of the main personal values that I mentioned before, this benevolence idea, see that women are remembered more for caring for others relative to men, and the difference between the two is exacerbated or increased over time as the age of the deceased actually increases as well. This fits with a lot of Susan Fisk's work with the stereotype content model. Women are often perceived as being higher on warmth relative to competence, so caring for other people and being more attuned to the not only emotional but also the psychological experiences of individuals, women compared to men. So we see these big shifts, not only based on time, but also the identity of the deceased. So pulling back the lens here, where this fits in is just simply identifying descriptive patterns and how we can use words as an indication of what people are thinking, feeling, and going through psychologically in the moment that they are reporting on legacy reflections. And that's the first third that I want to talk to you about. Again, this idea of diagnosing a problem. How do we understand what it means to live a good life? And now I'm going to focus on this second big camp and the second third of the talk. I'll talk to you a little about this idea of prognosis or predicting things in the future using language now as an IV instead of often a DV. Now, theoretically, what I'm going to be talking to you about is this idea of using words to predict collective action, to predict actual behavior that people have in the world. And this is guided by one of the things I've been thinking about as language patterns often being invitations or disinvitations towards action. Just as you would receive like a response card for an event, you either see a word that is really highfalutin and difficult to understand, that's a rejection, right? I'm not going to go there. But to the average person, you see a relatively simple word, and that's an invitation. You want to approach that thing that seems quite inviting, right? A lot of this is theoretically grounded in some of Norbert Schwarz's work, this idea of feelings as information theory, where quite often people use their feelings to judge how they think and understand a particular stimulus, and that impacts their downstream judgments and decisions. I didn't make this a shoddy image. This is for an experiment. So for example, with Stanford abstracts for dissertations, this is done by Danny Oppenheimer and colleagues. This looks pretty shoddy and you're kind of squinting saying, I'm trying to read it, right? How do I understand that? Relative if you were in the other condition, exact same text, but is really clear to look at. A disfluent text on the left visually versus a fluent text on the bottom right. You want to approach the second, typically avoid the first. And we can see these patterns also reflected in language, right? So the first paper title, I just made these up, right? Why people lie to others, understanding the reasons behind deception. Even if you're not a deception scholar like Jeff and me, you'd probably say, yeah, I might want to read that, right? But the second one, exploring the multifaceted motivations underpinning deceptive behaviors in interpersonal communication. Conceptually consistent, right? Kind of saying the same thing as the first, but you're kind of saying, maybe I'll read the abstract, but I'll pass, right? Approach versus avoid behaviors at the language level. That's what we're often talking about. Now, you've probably heard the phrase, keep it simple, stupid, right? Or keep it simple, whatever other S you want to put out there, right? And that is what 95% of studies in this world of fluency have really studied. And the minority of studies have looked at this idea of, well, when does the idea of complexity actually have these positive downstream benefits? I'm going to introduce you to one of my favorite studies in this regard by LeBrew and Kim in 2009, where they looked at this idea when metacognitive difficulty can be associated with downstream benefits. So let me walk you through what they did. I think it's really slick. Basically what they did was they had participants primed with a goal of be a kinder person, or just no priming whatsoever, a neutral goal basically. Then they had you read a fluent or disfluent text. something that's like almost an advertisement trying to get better outcomes for little kids, right? And they measured how much you want to donate to this particular cause. And if the simpler is better hypothesis that I basically told you about before, it's true, what we find exactly on the right side with that neutral goal, we find support for that idea. So after you read a really simple thing, people want to give more to after seeing that simple compared to difficult task. But if you're primed with what's called an instrumental goal, where you believe that someone's trying to do something that's really effortful and valuable and worthwhile, complexity is actually valued. So it's a flip of the effect when people are primed with a goal that is instrumental to the means. So here, when it's a difficult to process text, people really amplify how much they're willing to give to a particular cause compared to when it's very, very easy to process. So this basic idea is that difficult or challenging experiences can give off the feelings of effort, and people reward that if they believe that it's worthwhile, if it's instrumental to the means. What I've done here is I've looked at a bunch of areas for change where people are trying to organize to get behind a particular cause. One of the most popular platforms in this regard is change.org, where people really try to amplify their notoriety for a particular cause. How do they get people to buy into a particular cause? And what we look at are various markers of complexity. What we can think about is the degree to which a text is fluent, both at the lexical level, the stylistic level, and also the structural level. So at the lexical level, it's basically how simple is the noun or is the word. So the word use versus utilize, job versus occupation. So we have simple versus complex versions of those. And we also have stylistic fluency, which is the degree which the text is really formal or like a story. So formal being more complex, story being more like a narrative and much simpler. And also structural fluency, how understandable is the text based on the actual structure of it. So how long the words are, how readable the writing is. Here are some of the operationalizations if you care about that. So we take it Luke Dictionary as sort of the proxy for everyday terms. Luke's Analytic Thinking Index, which is high rates of articles and prepositions, low rates of pronouns, essentially, and looking at a Flesh Reading Ease Index, which is, again, how long the words are and how long the sentences are as well. So I collected about 1 million petitions across 5 different platforms in various languages as well, looking to see how the actual narrative of the petition itself related to how many people are going to sign it and if the petition was successful or not. And what you see here is a support for this contingent on effort hypothesis, contingent on presumed effort, right? The idea is that complex things are rewarded when people believe that effort is worthwhile and valuable in a particular setting. So if we just focus on the change.org data, for example, the one that had over 800,000 petitions, fewer common words, more analytic and more complex writing, and less readable writing was also provided with more support at the petition level. We find this effect also spanning various languages. So it's not just a US-centric effect, not just a English language effect as well. So this idea in this second camp is that we can use language patterns, again, to predict behavior. It's not just that language is behavior, but it can predict future behavior as well. And in the last little third of the talk, I couldn't be this close to Silicon Valley and be close to, or back in the Bay Area without talking about generative AI and a range of different things that I've been studying in that regard. So I wanted to talk about this third idea of catalysis and using large language models as a catalyst for change with some of, again, society's largest and gravest problems, which we have, is getting people to understand science and appreciate science that much more in everyday life. One of the big motivators for this was just the basic understanding that trust in scientists and perceived credibility of scientists has been decreasing over time, especially since the pandemic. There's a bunch of hidden stuff in here related to ideology, of course, and a lot of these things play into just overall simple distrust in scientists over time. But it's not just that people are trusting scientists less. They believe that scientists are still intelligent but awful communicators. We don't do a good job of meeting people where they are in terms of understanding, and also we talk past people in the general public instead of talking to them. So this motivated something for me is trying to understand how can we do better as scientists who care about getting our work out there other than the 3 people who read some of our articles, right? So going back to this idea of language patterns as an invitation or a disinvitation, I want to talk to you about the 95% of work that often happens, which is looking at the benefits of simple language, using simple language to produce simple science, to increase understanding and increase perceptions that people have about scientists in everyday life. So the big question is, can we keep it simple, scholars? And the way that I first wanted to do this is, and I'd say this at every single talk, the first research question here was purely a curiosity. I was like, I wonder if, and those are often some of my favorite studies. I wonder if this happens. Basically what I do is I looked at every PNAS paper that was published over 100 or about 100 years, where they actually had abstracts, and then they were also tethered to significant statements. Only in about the last 20-ish years do they have, at the article level, both abstracts and significant statements in the same one. So for example, a paper here, you see the top left, the academic abstract, which is for domain level experts, but the lay summary, the one on the bottom right, is for the average person trying to understand what the science was all about. Conceptually, a consistent match, but very different goals associated with them, right? So I wanted to see our authors for PNAS doing what they're expected to basically do, write simple for the simple stuff, write more complex for the complex stuff. And what we find is indeed that does happen, right? But what was really interesting to me was this effect size here, Cohen's D of about 0.31. It's a pretty small effect size. And trying to understand that as if people would appreciate that difference at the individual level. An average person reading one single abstract, what's the probability that they could really detect this is for me, this is something I want to approach as opposed to avoid? So what I wanted to use in my second sort of research question here is the idea that can we make science simpler using large language models as our sort of mechanism here? What I do is I gave GPT-4 the following prompt. This is the exact prompt that is in the instructions for authors for PNAS. Basically, the key part is in the middle. The statement should not contain any references, etc. Should explain the significance of research at a level understandable to an undergraduate educated scientist outside their field of specialty. At no point did they say make it simple, right? What's really critical about this, and I'll show in the next slide, is that large language models, and especially GPT-4 here, inferred that simplicity was required. Inferred that simplicity was a heuristic that should be applied to these data here. What we find across the common words measure that I've introduced before in some of these other studies, and also the Flesch reading ease index, we find that we can really amplify the effect size difference across these two groups by about a magnitude of 2 to 3. Right? We can really increase that quite a bit, showing that there is some potential to make science a bit simpler if that is a goal that us scientists really have. Now, going into the lab, what I wanted to see is there an effect on perceptions and actual knowledge as well? So in the second study, what I did, so I found various pairs of GPT-written significant statements, and then also PNAS authored statements, and found those that had the greatest difference between them, really trying to maximize the induction here. And what I had was 5 pairs, and I randomly assigned people to pairs, and then randomly assigned them to either the human or the AI stimulus within each pair. So for example, here's 3 out of the 5 that people are randomly assigned to. And then it was always the AI stimulus that was the simple one, and it was always the human one that was complex. Okay, so they were randomly assigned to each one within the pair. And I measured how do people think and feel about the author in terms of credibility, trustworthiness, and also how intelligent the author was perceived to be. I threw this in at the end, and I'm really glad I did, and I'll explain to you why in a second. The degree which people thought the summary was written by a human, and the degree which they thought it was written by artificial intelligence, and a bunch of manipulation checks to make sure that the simple ones were perceived as simpler compared to the complex ones, and indeed all those checked out. What we find here is that the simple ones, which again were always AI, the simple ones were consistently viewed as less intelligent but more credible and also more trustworthy compared to the complex ones. Again, AI is perceived as here, or the text written by AI is perceived better in most cases compared to the text written by a complex source, which happened to be the human. What was also really fascinating here is when the perceptions of who the author was, people perceived consistently the more complex one to be artificial intelligence and the simpler one to be humans, but it was the absolute reverse of that. What was interesting from this is that, okay, instead of only 5 stimuli, can we amplify the number of actual stimuli that were in the study and then see if people actually understood the science and could put it in their own words better after that? And that's exactly what I did here in study 3. So we had 20 stimulus pairs instead of just 5, and we had those authorship perceptions measures and the authorship attribution measures as well. I'm going to skip to the attribution measures. So again, we find that people attribute the source as being human for simple things, even though it's the reverse, right? And what was really interesting here is I asked people multiple choice questions about the science itself. These are like really difficult physics papers, difficult for me at least. Really difficult science. These were not typically social science things. So asking people multiple choice questions about them, and then also in their own words to basically what was this science all about? And I had large language models code them on a scale of 0, 1, and 2. 0 is and you got nothing right about this science. 1 is you kind of got there, but there's still some things missing. And 2 is it's fully right, okay? And what we found here is that there's a trend towards the simple science being associated with answering the multiple choice question more correctly compared to the more complex human written science. But what's really interesting here is that the actual coded responses, participants in their own words, got the science right more often when it was put simple text compared to a complex text. So there are these downstream benefits of having large language models reconfigure what science is written as, and then having people understand that. And as a psychology of language scholar, I had to look at the actual language of what people had in their free responses. And what was really cool is that the text was written in a more concrete and detailed manner when they saw the simple science compared to when they saw the complex science. So not only are people getting the science right, but in their own words, it's clearer and it's more concrete. So with that, I kind of flew through a bunch of studies in about a half hour. What I want to do is I want to leave a bunch of time for conversation. And what's really exciting is that this is sort of the beginning of a lot of stuff that I'm really excited about, not only with large language models, but also trying to understand more aspects of society that we can really evaluate through words. And I'll just leave this little tidbit again, is that if we really care about understanding the human condition, if we really care about understanding what's going on in people's lives every day and also at a sociological level, one starting point is to understand the words that we use to communicate to others. And I'll just give a small little plug here about a 60-page paper that a colleague of mine, Ryan Boyd, put out. If you're confused about why the effect flips between studies 2 and 3, so are we. And we're really excited about trying to figure out exactly what some of these moderating effects are, just beyond goal instrumentality, and also trying to figure out what are the contextual constraints placed upon language patterns and placed upon humans when we're trying to understand verbal behavior. We have some musings about that in this paper. So thank you for the time. It's really a pleasure being here.
Thank you, Dave, so much for running us through all of those studies and the various ways that language can tell us about ourselves. I wanted to start with some concrete things and then get a little bit more abstract, and then we'll open it up to the crowd. Wondering if we could just go back to the obituary studies. One of the things you didn't talk about, you were focused on benevolence, was after COVID, benevolence goes down in the US, but tradition looked like it went up. Is that right?
It goes down up until about this year 2. So right after about between year 1 and year 2 of the pandemic, we see an increase in tradition. We actually did look at what the flip was. And what we found, there's a way more increase in specific references to religion after year 1, year 2. It's hard for me to conjecture about why there was that shift, but it was something that we noticed.
Gotcha. Okay. So I was wondering if we were to think about the obituary study, right? And we wanted to rethink like how have things changed in the US. Could you give us like a higher level summary of what that is? So, I understand those two values, but what do you think it means to, live a good life pre and post COVID?
Yeah, I think this probably sounds somewhat obvious, not only after the study, but also a lot of our intuitions help to guide this, but we really care about close connections. So close connections are things that we yearn for as humans living in this quite complex world, but also these are the things that people ascribe as being meaningful upon reflecting on a person's life. So it's the people we're surrounded by and the people that we want to have remembered about us. Those are the things that people focus on. Those are quite persistent. So even though we see these cultural shifts maybe modifying that a bit, they're still quite prevalent. You saw like over 75% of them are represented. So it's not like it's this dip and we don't care at all about social connection, but it shows the power of things external to our control that impact how people are reflected on. So social connection, I think, is the biggest idea.
Okay, great. And then in the last study where you were, going over the, wait a minute, I'm getting confused. What was study 3 versus study 2?
Study 2 was online petitions.
Right.
And 3 was AI and simple science.
Right, exactly. So the simple science part, so one of the conclusions would be get GPT to write your significant statements. Do you have a conclusion that is like that, or are there too many concerns about, hallucination and saying things wrong? What would your advice to authors be?
So I do think hallucination could be a concern, but my biggest concern is, are the authors also agreeing that that's the type of science that they want communicated about their work too? Mm-hmm. So a thing that I didn't do in this work that I think is a really important next step is giving the authors of those rewritten statements the GPT ones and be like, hey, does this effectively capture what you think a lay summary is? I thought about doing that. I thought the risk was too high for publishing it for that. And also scaling that for a ton of, let's say, first authors of hundreds and hundreds of one, the response rate would probably be super low. But I think that's actually the lowest hanging fruit here. Go get authors of these papers to figure out, does this do a really good job for you? If it does, then why wouldn't we scale and leverage these tools that can do this in an effective way?
Would you think of similar things for other domains? So one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about here is the different kinds of policies that get implemented around, for example, you look at the DSA thinking about harms on social media. So those are written in fairly, difficult language because it has to be precise. Are there ways that you've been thinking about simplifying policies so that it can be understood by larger groups?
Yeah, I think like terms and conditions make a really are a simple context to think about that here. I think, again, if we use the metaphor of like approach versus avoid with certain types of language, why wouldn't we want to give people effective decision tools, which could be simple language? And I think that's one easy way to do it. Something I came across in my research while I was doing this work is this idea of simple Wikipedia. Have you guys heard of simple Wikipedia? It's awesome. It's a version of Wikipedia that's just like a paragraph long, and it's written in plain English for the average person about every single article. So it has a really nice one-to-one match, and indeed we do find that it is written simpler. We've done the work to figure out that it is, but that's a really cool way of thinking about, can we use that as a way to introduce the same thing for various policies? Yeah, simplicity is something that hopefully we should strive for in a lot of things. Obama thought about this in 2010 with the Plain Writing Act, and yeah, carrying that forward is really important.
Right on. Okay, I'll ask my last question before opening it up. You started off the talk with a couple of provocative quotes from Milgram and from Saussure. Both of them were essentially, we are the messages between us. If that's all we had, then we could understand each other. Saussure went even further, that that's really all we are. How would you think of those quotes now in the context of these AI technologies, which essentially are just the words we left between each other, and now that is all they are? It's just words and messages.
But what a beautiful record that we have of human existence, but also social interactions. Like, I think it's the underlying social and psychological dimensions of language that I think really are super important here, not necessarily even just the production of them. So yes, it might be an amalgamation of all the things that we have communicated as society, but I actually don't view that as a bug. I sort of view that as a feature. Like, look at all of what we've created. Like, these are the records that will persist and leave behind, which I think could tie into the obituary thing, which is like, let's have these ideas persist.
Okay, great. Well, let's open it up to the audience and see if there's any questions out there. We have some in the back. Great. Thanks, Jan.
Hello. Hi, David. I have two questions, and both come from different spaces. One of them comes from the journalism field, and that is obituary speak. A lot of us who were trained as journalists began writing obituaries.
Yeah. I've
And
talked
there,
to a lot of journalists and they've said exactly right, the same thing.
and there is the irony or the fallacy of the obituary. He had a boisterous personality. He was a drunk. Provided amply for his family, never had a job. So how do you account for the ironies of language and also the lingo of death?
Yeah.
Because generation after generation were referred to things as particular ways. And very quickly, I also worked for change.org. And there was also the same kind of lingo and the same kind of irony in the petitioning language.
Yeah. And what's also interesting, change.org, I'm not sure if you wrote the recommendations for authors, but the recommendations for authors were completely the opposite of what the results were founding. So the results were keep everything super simple, don't say too much, make it really, really short. And the evidence suggests sort of the opposite. So our lay intuitions about what is best for behavior, what's best to predict behavior, is actually opposite of what the science says. But I'll address your first question, if that worked. What we looked at in some of our preliminary work was just overall emotions that were represented in obituaries. So that might be able to say, well, is there some hidden, oh, this person really wasn't as great as we're trying to make them out to be, but we have to use it more flowery language because an obituary requires that. There was only about like a 0.5% difference between positive and negative emotions across all the obituaries. So I think it was like 2.5% positive emotion, 2% of all the words in these texts were negative emotion. So if we really thought that these were just like changing or making things more flowery than the person actually was, I would expect like a bigger gap there. It would be like 5% positive and like 1% negative, or like 10% positive, 1% negative. So I think people are kind of being true to how a person really was or how they want to remember them, at least in terms of like a basic binary of like positive to negative. Does that help to sort of address what you were thinking of? Oh, sure. The answer is maybe no.
Hi, David. First off, before the talk, we had a little bit of a teaser from our host about the 27 Club, rock and roll folks who died. Do you have any insights that you didn't share with us yet?
Yeah, so if we remember self-reference is first person singular, that's often a huge indicator of psychological distress. So in the lyrics of those from the 27 Club compared to those who were also in the 27 Club but died by accident, so suicide versus accident, the suicide group had significantly higher rate of self-references compared to those who were in the accident group. So there's a big focus on myself. You read the lyrics and you see like Amy Winehouse, for example, Jimi Hendrix, all focused on the self or a lot on the self compared to Jim Morrison, who died of a heart attack, for example.
Hi, David. Great talk. Thank you. I'm interested to hear more about your thoughts, like, I guess, since you study language, like from a psychological perspective, like whether you think complexity, like linguistic complexity, is like distinct from difficulty, if that makes sense. Like something being challenging versus just like the complexity of a sentence, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think they're definitely linked. So like as complexity increases, I think difficulty also increases, but I don't think it's linear. I would imagine at some point it's like too complex or too difficult is just really going to push up against people's feelings, and they're really going to go against it, right? One of the things we're actually trying to study right now is, and I borrowed this from one of my former colleagues, Ellen Peters, this idea of subjective versus objective. She studies numeracy. So the feeling that like I'm good with numbers versus I'm actually good with numbers. Now I want to think about this when we're understanding complexity. Like some people think I am awesome with big words. And then there are some people who say and they're objectively like really, really good on verbal tasks. So I think there's this probably really cool 2x2, which is people who are really good objectively or really bad objectively with words, and then people who think and feel like they are or are not really good with words, to see who those individuals are in society and to see how it actually might impact who they are acting in everyday life. So I think you're onto something, and hopefully at some point in the future, we'll have data to speak to it.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious about the science communication point. So yeah, it's like totally on board with the idea that scientists ought to be better at communicating to the general public. But I guess I'm also thinking about like the costs of potentially of the like oversimplification of ideas. And I'm curious how you think about that, because there's like prominent cases of like, you know, the Mozart effect is like, oh, just play classical music to your baby and they'll be smart. But that's like, you know, an overgeneralization of this like really specific phenomenon found in this study on the relationship between classical music exposure and intelligence. So I'm curious how you think about that, where like the simplification actually also results in some sort of inaccuracy in understanding.
Yeah, that could be a really big problem with oversimplifying, right? And we haven't done enough work here to figure out where that critical point is. Like, when is too simple really going to undermine people in terms of either how much they care about a topic, or even if they're able to understand the actual essence of the science, or if that they wouldn't be able to do that. So that is something we're actively working on now to figure out where that sweet spot is, but not only just at scale, but for each individual, right? It's very possible for a particular subfield, your ability to handle or understand complex science might be different than mine, than Jeremy's and Jeff's, et cetera, right? So fine-tuning these things to the individual is actually where I think the secret sauce could be. And we could use large language models to actually do that, I think, but we'll help test it.
All right, great. Oh, we have another question here.
Okay, here, let's use the microphone so the people on Zoom can.
Hello. So I wonder, so one thing I noticed is an increase in shift towards like online, like webcomics and stuff, which can be in a way an embodiment of how it's easier to disseminate or read information through simpler means. I wonder if like, what if science articles could be translated into different modes of language, like not just a research article paper or LLM generated summary, but also say like comic form, and also like suggesting like science study, like experiments in real life that people can experience for themselves the effects of the conclusions drawn from the science articles.
Yeah, I think you're onto something really important. What we're doing right now is running an experiment with taking the exact same journal article and then a notebook LM podcast version of that article, and seeing how people actually can comprehend science better, or where there is that point of which understanding either plateaus, or just figuring out how people understand science better. We don't have the data yet, but we're trying to figure that out. So I think you're really onto something. Modality matters, but we don't know how much it actually.
It's good. I've often been thinking about that too, of like using LMs to communicate to different audiences. A lot of times in our talks, it has to be to scientists, policymakers, people in industry. So we use some of these tools to communicate to different audiences with more fluency? Yeah. All right, great. Oh, Matt.
Hi, thanks. Really interesting talk. So you talked a lot in the beginning about sort of the power of language and studying language. Some of the work that I do is related to sort of social media and stuff like that. And so I think often about the context in which people are sharing language. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit more about how you think about that, since you've studied in like a bunch of different spaces, and into the first question about like obituaries. People are kind of trying to signal certain things in sort of the social public space. So how do you sort of conceptualize that for different spaces and stuff like that?
How long?
Yeah.
Been thinking about context for about a decade and a half. We've made small progress. In a person's life that shift how they're communicating. It's like psychological dynamic. What people are trying to achieve, pragmatic goals, really. Saw that studies here. The last one, this one's actually most right now, which is genre convention. So the way that you write a love book is typically like scientific, like email response. And that has implications for base rates. And I think the constraints that a genre on modern day NLP. So I could point you to a recent paper that we here's how to possibly do it better. It's quite complex, especially if we're not process. If we're just only trying to automate it, it's really, really hard.
Cool, thanks.
Thank you, David, for the amazing talk. My question is related to Jeff's question about how AI impact how we like write and dress our ideas. Because your talk is about like language capture our human values. And I work with librarians who have anecdotal, like older adults ask whether AI can help them write obituaries. So my question is about like the third study you have refers to we can possibly use LM to help us craft our language. But for general public and scientists, do you have a recommendation for how to use LM to the extent that it can capture the ideas, the social relationship, and the what we want to express without losing that agency?
Yeah, recommendations for the general public for this. Well, what's interesting is that I'm not sure the degree to which people are using large language models in their everyday workflows for people in the general public. We have some data that's like 0.5% of all of people's web browsing history is AI related. That's a really, really small percentage of everyday browsing history. I think, especially probably in this area, I think that large language models are like used a ton, right? And they are probably in a lot of Stanford space. Using AI in everyday workflows, not often. So I think one idea would be to first assess the degree to which people feel comfortable using these ideas in such tasks like you described, but then almost in like a understanding the rules of the road with using these tools, almost like coaching them in that regard. I think almost like thinking of like ordinary ways of teaching and reinforcement learning, which is like with a tutor, with an actual person who might help to guide you in that way. That could be really helpful for people, especially if they're either not sure about it or they don't know how to use it.
All right, great. Well, one more here with Jeremy with the last question.
Thanks, Dave. It's just incredible what you're working on. It's just an absolute treat to watch you speak. Thanks for being here. I get to talk to you this afternoon, so just to prime the conversation, when Roger Schenck and Bob Abelson in the 1970s create conceptual dependency model, the whole idea of it is that all words can be reduced to a minimal mathematical formula to represent what the words are. And I'm struck here by what you're doing, which is, you're operationalizing how far away you are from the vision of this mathematical minimal formula from Schenck and Abelson. And I'm wondering if you thought, you and I worked together to build an embedded index and, learned a little bit about that process. When you make an embedding, whichever model you choose, you can vary in its complexity and simplicity, and they're not all equal. So I'm curious if you thought about when you create a vector, varying the technique in order to force the complexity and simplicity as you build an index, and then as you pass the query through that index, and just thinking about what the downstream effects of that.
I have not thought about it, but I think it's actually really critical because the option space is actually, at some point, the way that every person, if we're talking about just humans for a second, bear with me, the option space is actually pretty limited. Like we have a set list of words that we typically use. Like the average person's going to use about like a unique number of 3,700 words every day. But we're not constrained by that anymore. Like the option space is actually kind of limitless. So thinking through that and the implications for it, especially for when we're thinking about how language can actually impact behavior. If we increase the number of features, the number of features linguistically, does that increase the number of behaviors that we can impact? I don't know the answer to that, other than I think we should probably test it. But no, it's a great question.
Great way to prime that.
We have 2 questions on Zoom if we have time.
Yeah, let's do one of them from Zoom, please.
Yes, the first question by an anonymous attendee is, what are the influences on cultural factors on the simplicity, intelligibility, perception of intelligence, trustworthiness, etc. Have you looked also on extending this study to other languages?
Yeah, so at least to speak to the second study where we looked at the relationship between language and the narrative, like of change.org petitions and then signatures. We did look across languages, German, Dutch, French, Italian, Portuguese, etc. We found a consistent pattern in that complex is valued, right? Complexity is associated with more petition signatures. So these were from not only different countries, but also languages associated with those countries. So the degree to which it's a pan-cultural effect, I don't know if we can go that far, but at least a cross-cultural effect in this one particular instance.
Great. Okay, well, we better wrap up there so we stay on time. Thank you again very much, David, for joining us. Next week, we have Ontario Garcia from the Education Department here at Stanford, who thinks a lot about technology policies in the context of school and especially across different communities with different levels of equity and servedness. So please join us next week for Ontario's talk. Thank you again, David.